Welcome everyone. My name is Natasha French. I am the chapter president for the VR/AR Association for Los Angeles. I'm super excited to host today's session on how inclusive design enhances the customer experience. As members of the organization, we had a lot of requests to host an event around accessibility, and what better time to host it than this month. We'll be celebrating Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is on May 20th and is very dear to my heart with the work I've been doing with Diamond. So a little bit about our association. The VR/AR Association is a global organization designed to foster collaboration between innovative companies and people in the VR and AR space. And to start the event, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Mr. Joe Devin, who is the co-founder of Diamond, as well as the co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. A little bit about Joe. Joe is a serial entrepreneur who's been fostering the growth of the LA ecosystem since 2008. As a co-founder of Diamond, which is an inclusive digital agency, and of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, him and his team in 2019 launched the first ever State of Accessibility report, which will be coming out the end of this year. When Joe's not solving tech challenges for major organizations, you can find him on stage influencing every developer and corporation to build digital projects with inclusive design in mind. So Joe, I'm gonna hand this over to you so you can introduce the rest of the panelists, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to the VR/AR Association for putting this together. Before we begin, I would like to invite each of the panelists to turn on their video and audio, and please introduce yourself. Let us start with Matthew, or Matt, really.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt King, and I'm a technical program manager for accessibility at Facebook, and I've been working in this field for decades.
Thanks, Matt. Andreas?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Andreas Forsland. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cognition. We are in the process of building an extremely accessible HMD called Cognition One, which includes a brain-computer interface with augmented reality.
Thanks, Andreas. Can you also define HMD just so that the audience?
Sure. Head-mounted display. So it's an AR headset with a clear lens, and users can wear it and use it and interact hands-free and voice-free using head gaze and basically mental fixation on AR elements.
Great. Thank you, Andreas. Christopher?
Good morning. My name is Christopher Patno. I am the head of accessibility programs and disability inclusion at a little startup called Google. You might have heard of us. And I've been working in AR, VR for about 10 years now.
Thanks, Christopher. Good luck with your startup there.
Thank you.
Regine?
Hello, everyone. I am Regine Gilbert. I'm an industry assistant professor at New York University in the Integrated Design and Media program. My focus is on user experience design and accessibility, and I have created a couple of courses for UX in AR and VR for Tandon Online.
Thank you, Regine. Now, I'd like to remind all of you, if anyone needs closed captions at the bottom, you can click on CC. There's also a live transcript feature that folks may not realize that you can access that will put a little panel to the right of the screen, which is really pretty cool. I also would like to remind you that Q&A is welcome. So please click on the Q&A button and ask any questions. And toward the end of this panel, we will get to those. Because AR, VR, XR, all of those, there's so many different definitions, and we don't know exactly who in the audience understand this. I'd like to just start with definitions. So we don't need everybody to weigh in, but if somebody can speak to what is the difference, let's say, between VR, AR, MR, XR, please do so, so anyone can take this.
Well, I'll jump in. So the most simplistic way of describing it is, virtual reality is a fully self-contained immersive experience where 100% of the experience is controlled and designed. So you have your full field of view is immersed in a visual interface. Augmented reality is where you're wearing a headset similar to VR, except it's a clear lens, and you're looking out onto the real world, and digital content is juxtaposed over the real world and sometimes fools the mind into believing it's actually real because of how it's designed to interact with sensors. So feel free to pile on.
Anybody feel there's something missing?
Well, XR is sort of the definition of both AR and VR. I honestly, if even just by all my years here, I don't understand the difference between MR and AR. Maybe it's marketing reality. I'm not quite sure.
Yes, I asked this question also because I struggle with the marketing of it. I feel like we don't know how this is all going to shake out. And I think had we known in retrospect how it would turn out, we probably would have marketed it a little bit differently. But regardless, the more important thing is that we get everything right and particularly accessible. So I'm going to pass that on as well as a question. Please define accessibility, especially when it comes to these XR or VRs.
I'd love to talk about that.
Great.
So first of all, just generally, accessibility is designing and building for the broadest array of humans and human ability. Each one of us right now has a unique combination of physical, neural, cognitive capabilities, and that combination of capabilities and abilities is always on a continuously changing spectrum as you age and experience the events of life, right? So
yeah.
Like I have normal age-related hearing loss, but unusual vision because I've been blind for a long time, but that's all just part of my lens on the world. So designing and building for the broadest possible group of people is really the focus of the field of accessibility. And that applies to the built world, the information that we share with one another in the world and our environment, and any kind of information technology, including a virtual world. And I think one of the most important aspects of accessibility that we especially have to think about in the virtual world is that accessibility is really defined by the combination of our capabilities and our environment. So to the extent that the environment is built or designed to give you the same benefits that it gives me or anybody else, is the extent at which that environment is accessible. And of course, in the virtual world or an augmented world, we can add or remove things to the environment that make it better suited to any given individual. And how well we do that is how accessible that world will be.
Thanks, Matt. Regine, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think, just adding on to what Matt said, I would say it's offering options as well to users, and not just having one way of doing things. I think accessibility at the end of the day is offering options.
Thank you. Now I have a question that's a little hard to put together, but what I'd say is there's some platforms like radio, or let's say the Clubhouse audio app, that are terrible if you're hard of hearing, but wonderful if you're visually impaired. Whereas TV, a visual medium, might be better suited to you if you're hard of hearing, but it's probably not going to be really great if you're blind. And just to put a finer point on it, you can do something like add captions to an audio app, but you'll never get live captions when you have 25 people speaking in the room. And even if you can get automated captions to work, it's going to be pretty messy, and it'll mean almost reading a book when you're in an audio app. So if you're hard of hearing, you're probably never going, and this is also speaking with friends, you're never going to really use an audio app. So I guess my question is, where do we draw the line in our expectations for the platforms when one thing is better suited for one type of disability, the other is better suited for the other? Do we get mad at a platform that they didn't make automated captions when they're an audio only app? And let's start with Christopher.
Thank you. And I have to say, this question has been spinning my brain since we talked about this last week. And I think maybe it's my time in university coming back to me, but I've been thinking about reality and the nature of reality as it comes to this. And so here you go. And I apologize for this view into my brain. I think about this sort of like an accessibility paradox, where the same piece of technology, whether it's built or digital, is both accessible and not accessible at the same time. Like Schrodinger's cat, you put this cat in a box, put in a radioactive isotope, close the door, and the expectation is it is both alive and dead. And the thing that makes it choose, and from a quantum perspective, is the opening of the box. So I believe it's not a great analogy, but it's where I am right now in terms of accessibility, because your reality is based off your perception of it. Light, what you see is actually a reflection and is translated by your brain. What you hear is actually waves of air, essentially, and your brain translates it into things. So what you're seeing isn't reality. What you're hearing isn't reality. It's all interpreted. If you think about language, it's just noise that our brains knows how to process. Some do and some don't. If you don't know the language, it's noise. If you know the language, it's interesting. So for me, and even time has an aspect of this based off species. A time for a fly is going to be really different than a time for a tree or a person. It's the same time, but how we interpret it is really different. So for me, XR is sort of a reality customization device. It allows us to take a perceived reality and translate it into something that we can understand. So coming back to time dilation is something that I find really interesting, especially when it comes to consumption of digital information. Screen readers, for someone who's a native screen reader user, comes in really fast. And if you don't know how to understand it, it sounds like gibberish. But it's information coming in at the speed of someone who understands it. Something we've been doing with my community group with captions, we realize that if you slow down captions, it's actually a better user experience for the people who use them. So you need to slow down reality to be able to get the captions and have the time to sort of process them. So if you are a person by yourself, you can experience the reality that you need based off your skills. It becomes a problem when you're working with other people, but that's separate. So this idea of time dilation and transcribing reality based off your needs is this customization that Regine and Matt were talking about. Taking it to Clubhouse, I think these things should exist. I don't think we want to stop anyone from innovating, ever. But what I think you need to do is be thoughtful about how to make it accessible, and we'll need new interaction modes. So to your point, Joe, about this wall of text coming in, that's absolutely not usable. But also, there's no way to interact if you're a person who needs to type because you may not be verbal. So for technologies like Clubhouse to be accessible, we need to think about it differently. Perhaps you have text-only rooms, so people who speak at a textual speed can do that, and they can interact with themselves because they're all typing and they're all reading, as opposed to a room where it's all spoken. So there are ways to do it, but you have to sort of break your ways of thinking.
There's something I would like to add to this, which is that accessibility in communications is also a social construct. When you're blind and you go to a party, nonverbal communications is completely inaccessible to me unless I have somebody there to help me understand what's going on in the room, or unless everybody in that room does something to help me understand that. And that also goes for if you're deaf and you walk into a party where everybody's talking, either the people in the room will include you or not include you. And that is a decision, and it's a social decision, and it has something to do with the way we interact with one another. So when people choose to interact on Clubhouse, if there was somebody who is deaf and they want to interact, well, it would not only have to be a technical solution, but a social solution. And yes. I think we need to remember that aspect.
I find myself nodding as you speak, wishing I could communicate my nod to you without interrupting you, ironically. And there's a limit to what you can do, but you're absolutely right. If you come in it with intention, it's certainly helpful. So, and Christopher, you're so smart that you've touched on so many things that require lots of reading for folks to really follow. But I'm just going to grab one thread of it and then pass it to Andreas to perhaps explain it and at the same time comment. So in what you were describing about how sound comes into your ears and is processed and turned into signals in your brain, the same thing with a vision. This is the basis of sensory substitution, which you and I have spoken about before, because we both have an admiration of David Eagleman, and I'm not jealous that you've met him and everything. Andreas, can you explain sensory substitution and then comment on anything you'd like to add to that Clubhouse question?
Sure. Well, without getting too deep into some neuroscience, there's a lot of literature in science, decades of research in the areas of this. A lot of it has to do with prosthetic development and thinking through things like phantom limbs and other types of things where your nervous system, essentially, if you think about your nerves, right, you've got your central nervous system, which is all sort of contained inside of your skull. And then you have your peripheral nervous system, which runs down your spine and out to all your organs and through your appendages. So you essentially have two integrated electrical chemical systems in your body that work together. And so if you think about that, even if you lost a limb, like you lost your hand, as an example, it doesn't mean that your peripheral system stops functioning, right? You're still sending electrical and chemical currents and impulses to your motor neurons in your arm, as an example. So the ability to use sensors to detect motor neuron activity in your arm, if you're really clever at reverse engineering, right, the mechanical properties of that, you can create a digital phantom hand in virtual reality that is a substitute of your hands. And so an organization like Matt, the Control Lab guys and that team, they're working on that, right? Creating essentially an armband that reads your muscle movement activity and tries to recreate hands in the digital world. You think about the role of a cochlear implant, right? Or hearing aids, to help amplify information. So, what ends up, or even someone who has a brain injury, right? Somebody who has a brain injury in a particular region of the brain where scientists have felt like, oh, well, that's the region of the brain that affects language. But then what ends up happening sometimes during therapy and other things is that the brain adapts itself, right, through plasticity, and it can actually start to recover itself to some degree, where regions of the brain, other regions of the brain can start to pick up and take over some of that workload of language. So there's some really fascinating stuff going on in science and the way the brain works and the nervous system that effectively makes it possible for companies like Cognition and Control Labs and other folks to create wearable devices, or in some cases like Elon Musk's Neuralink, they can create an implant. These are things that are trying to harness the nervous system and translate it into kind of a quasi-prosthetic, right? And you say, the word prosthetic or sensory substitution is sort of perceived as a really clunky, heavy thing that's dedicated to a really small percentage of the population. But what we're seeing is like our smartphone is a way of augmenting our own intelligence, right? It makes it faster access to information. Or like what you're saying, David Eagleman doing audio. They're basically translating sound into vibration patterns for low vision and the blind, to be able to have an alternative sense of what's going on around them. So the ability for the brain to adapt to new senses, either to replace things they already had or to develop new senses, like a sixth sense or a seventh sense, it's entirely possible, right? And I think over the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to start to see more companies like, Neosensory, which is Eagleman's company, or Control Labs or Cognition, working on these kinds of problems where we can create adaptive interfaces that bring computing closer to the body, and a user interface, a usable user interface for interacting with it that can be used with a very wide range of individuals. So I think your earlier question about defining accessibility was, I sort of see it as synonymous with usability. And the challenge is who are the individuals that are in your usability studies, right? So whoever's developing it is usually developing it for themselves or their paradigm, and usually testing it with people like themselves. And so I think we need to open our aperture of who we recruit into our usability studies, and in our design intent, making sure that we have the right representation of users. So
those are great points. A big kick I'm on right now is that we have all our accessibility statistics are wrong, because if you get the kind of hearing and vision that, let's say, the vision I have in my 50s or my dad had in his 80s, and as you're getting older, you say this is normal, it's not a disability. Whereas if you have that at 5 years old, you'll call it a disability. And then we're basing our statistics on this. But 34% of the population is above 50 and probably has the kind of vision and hearing issues that I might have. And that is part of accessibility as well. And I think it's something that AR, VR really has to nail that personalization, because we're recreating the physics of the human body. So I love the point that you brought there. And I'll add one more thing before I pass it to you, Regine. There's a book, I wish I remembered the name, speaking about the phantom limb, and particularly phantom limb pain, that the way when the limb was lost, if it happened in an accident and there was pain at the time, the last memory of that sense is what causes the pain. And the VR applications you're referring to actually help get rid of that pain, because suddenly you feel that limb again, and then you don't have pain associated with it. So it's super fascinating stuff. And I think this is the future of AR, VR, or XR. So Regine, if you could comment to the previous, what was discussed previously, and perhaps particularly, what are your thoughts about adding new senses, new powers, be it with a wearable or be it with AR, VR?
I mean, I tell you what I'd like to see is a lot more innovation. I think that we have an opportunity with this technology to explore it more. I really want to see more people with disabilities actually making stuff, because I think that's going to provide immense input. And as a matter of fact, like, this is what I'm like cheering on, because if we don't, in the fame of the phrase "nothing about us without us," if we don't have that going on, you will have things like Clubhouse, right, which is excluding a group of people, and it sucks at the end of the day. And the thing about this, the opportunity within the XR space that we have, is to make it usable. Like Andres was saying, we have a great opportunity, and now is the time to like incorporate it not only into the experiences that we're making, but the tools themselves, right? Because I just did some research around looking at the tools, and very few of the tools are actually accessible, which means when you're not creating tools that are accessible, how are you creating experiences that are accessible? So I think in a lot of ways, we need to look at the landscape as a whole and see what we can do, where the gaps are with accessibility and inclusion, and then start to fill them so that we can make experiences that people will actually be able to use and enjoy.
Thank you. Christopher, feel free to comment on anything that was mentioned before, but let's add something new in here. And let's see, what should we make that? How about captions? Captions, and we touched on haptics, so let's add haptics when it comes to these things, and captions. How would they work in XR?
Sure. So I do want to throw out to Andreas's point of the companies that are doing interesting things. A couple of years ago, I discovered a company called Brainport, where they put an electric tab on the tongue, and the brain will rewire itself to create an image that can be seen. Just the pliability of the brain is just so fascinating, and our ability to adapt to the things around us is remarkable. Coming into the captions, I'm part of a community group with W3C where we have about 12 people who are deaf, partnering with some technologists and content producers to come up with what we consider sort of the first set of recommendations in terms of accessible captions for VR. We have some really neat ideas. One of them was this time dilation. Slow it down. 75% is the number that we're working with right now as sort of the optimal speed for being able to keep captions running, especially when you have a mixed session. We also have a thing called the transcript, a transient transcript, when you have multiple people talking at the same time, and there's no way you can turn around fast enough without missing something. So we sort of see them one after another, and then with arrows pointing towards direction. You'll also want to have like some kind of speaker ID or icon, so you know who's saying what. So we don't want to sort of take the standard 2-line captions from television and bring it into XR. So that was one of our rules. Don't take what we expect. Create something new that takes advantage of the new space. And there's a bunch there. And I'm really proud of the work that the team has done. That's VR. In terms of AR and captions, Google recently published a paper called Wearable Subtitles, in which it's a pair of glasses that uses ASR and actually can create subtitles of real world around you.
Please define ASR.
So ASR is automatic speech recognition. Okay. So it's the same thing that Live Transcribe does. I think this is what is happening here with the captions here. It's a computer translating and creating the language, the text out of what's spoken.
I believe these are live captions, actually. As a human being. Yeah.
Even better.
Yeah.
but the ASR is those are going to be the best. They have the most context, but if you don't have a human, the ASR is a great next step and a next opportunity. And having the ability to have the captions right in front of you, icons for sound, things like this, gives you that awareness that you don't have to necessarily learn and to interpret with a band. So again, not perfect, and different things work for different people. To the point several people have made here, it's all very individualized, and we need to have options, and different people will learn and take information in different ways.
Thank you. Matt, let's have you comment on this audio. What is the audio description of XR? And also let's add something else. XR development today is the equivalent of where the 1990s web development was. What are the current table stakes in the world of accessibility that translate well into the XR space?
Really good questions. I actually wonder if we're even to the 1990s yet in XR. So I started using a screen reader in 1985, I think. And at that time, we had, pretty decent access to most computing tasks. And it's kind of interesting that was a text-based world, and it really adapted well to screen reading. And then we went into the GUI world starting in the late 80s and into the 90s. And there was a big dip in accessibility, which I don't think we really recovered from until sometime after the year 2005 at least. And in some ways, we never recovered it, because when you think about all the things that are possible in a graphical world versus all the things that were possible in a text world, it's quite possible that I had a larger access percentage-wise to what was possible, in the 1980s. And I think XR extends that problem further. But I don't want to paint the picture as something really dim, because this is also a space for new innovation and opportunity and customization that was previously not possible. So the kind of tasks that I can complete on my iPhone today are far more advanced than the kinds of tasks that I could complete on a PC or a dumb terminal in 1985. So while I have, while there might be a lot of computing that's sort of out of reach, the things that are within reach is massively greater. And so, it's kind of hard to play this in time, but we're really early on. And the thing that's different now versus 1985 or 1995 in the world of XR is we don't have a paradigm yet. So we talk about audio description, for movies is sort of taking the visual built world and making it non-visually accessible. So what's going on in a movie, for instance, can be described in between dialogue, and that's what audio descriptions are today. But how well does that translate into the XR world? I'm not sure that it will, or how well it will. It's too early to know. Haptics can obviously play a big role in compensating for what we might not be able to pick up with audio description, but also different ways of using audio. So, when I walk into a room, I have a sense of the size of the room that's sort of based on sound and air pressure. Almost anybody has with some, I don't think it's all entirely hearing based, because yes. If I put eyeglasses on, it actually affects my, some glasses affect my ability to detect things that are in front of me. I think some of that has to do with air pressure and air circulation as well. And I don't know how we recreate these things in the XR world. There's just so much room for innovation and exploration that I think we're just in really pioneering spaces, not just for blindness, but for most disabilities.
Matt, that was an amazing answer. And I think that someone who can hear what you just said is going to develop some kind of fan and some kind of API that says, how big is this room? And do some kind of air pressure so that people can feel the size of the room. That was fantastic. Thank you for that. Wow, I love this panel. All right, next there's kind of a reaction to our discussion on captions from the one and only Meryl Evans, who is a captions expert. And she wrote, I've been in AltSpace VR and tried its captions. It was like watching a tennis match to look at the captions, which are speech bubbles with each avatar. Dizzying. Is there another way to do this without the back and forth? So Christopher or anybody want to reference that? You're on mute, Christopher.
You'd think after 15 months you learn. We've done a bunch of research on our side in terms of association of captions to the avatar, and if they're close together, it's okay. What we've seen is it's better when they're close together. When they're farther apart, that's when you want to have something like the transient transcript, so you don't have to do this back and forth. It's really difficult to be able to turn your head fast enough, especially in real time, and capture these things. So having some other kind of user interface element that is cognizant of your field of view of what you're seeing, and bringing this together, it's possible, but it hasn't been solved. Here's an opportunity for innovation.
There we go. Someone else who's listening is going to fix this. All right. And then Meryl says, P.S. I did try to position myself to see everyone, but when I did that, the captions were too hard to read. No winning. Yeah. And then Johnny has a question. Let's see. Is anyone seeing a solution that is looking at input modality for accessibility as part of the XR stack? As an example, interface adapts based on accessibility profile. Go for it, Andreas.
Yeah, hey, Johnny, good question. I think that's really the center of what we're doing, at least within our company, is we're trying to deal with that as a full stack situation, right? And to your earlier point, like comparing accessibility to the web in the 90s versus today, it is night and day in the sense that your toolkit was much smaller then, right? You had fewer things to pull on, to change and design with, right? You had HTML 1, Photoshop 1, so everything was the 1.0 of everything, right? You had a mouse and a keyboard, that was it, maybe a stylus. So if you think about it today, we have like this abundance, right? Like there's just so many sensors and there's so much data that we could be using as designers and developers and business people to be thinking about what's the right mix of things and what's the right use case and the right design, that it's almost embarrassing how much abundance we have at our disposal right now. So with all of that technological sort of, that palette is so rich, really it does come down to the use cases, right? What are those use cases you think you want to design sort of a best-in-class solution for, right? And start to experiment with that. I mean, the community is large, and and thinking about, could you create a best-in-class captioning? And then like what Chris is saying is, when you have these two avatars, there's sort of this gravitational issue or a distance issue of like when they start to pull apart, like maybe when they're together, they're separate, but when they pull apart, you have this intermediary transcript. So there's kind of a relationship there. So it takes time to kind of iterate on all those. And so you need a big creative community with tools that are easy to use and develop with, because you really want to see massive rapid prototyping happening across the entire world, so that the best ideas really like democratize accessibility in the development toolkits, so that more people can actually be creating stuff and seeing what things win, what things are the preferred methods. For us, we're dealing with a variety of inputs and outputs. So I think it's a more conceptual suggestion, but in the past, we've always been talking about the IO meaning input output, as the interface. But I think that's almost too passe. It's kind of, it's like the dinosaur term for what it is now. And we like to internally reframe it as intention and outcome, right? Because we have all these sensors, we have all this AI, we have all this context awareness now at our disposal. Can we actually transform the user experience such that we can use sensors to understand your intention? And can we understand or predict maybe an outcome you're trying to get to, and reduce the amount of time using software and algorithms, so that what used to be that transaction of touching a screen, or the transaction of clicking on something, in that amount of milliseconds for that transaction to happen, can we actually process intention and outcomes? And then within that, can you have a set of settings, right? So like today, you pick up an iPhone or an Android, and you go into the accessibility section of the operating system, and it's this like a laundry list of like all this stuff, and you're like, what do I do with all this stuff, right? It's a bucket for everybody, So I think, Johnny, your comment around, are there sort of preset default profiles and things like that? I think that's maybe one way of addressing it. But this ability what we're trying to do is say, can we take all these settings, right? Whether it's gaze control, we need stabilization, or we need to have, how much dampening and stabilization and like gimbal control and offsetting, like Correa and movement, versus do we need to have alternative access with like multiple switch? Like, can we have multi-switch control as opposed to a single switch control? Thinking about this as a set of knobs and sliders, and then can you create recipes? Basically, can a user manually train all these settings, set them up so that they can be personalized, and then later, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, can AI actually help automatically listen to your biometrics and adapt these settings to you, right? So that the system learns you. So it's kind of like your favorite pair of jeans. You didn't buy them and they weren't your favorite pair of jeans. It took several washes and several life stories in those jeans for them to become your favorite pair of jeans. So I think the same opportunity with mixed reality is using sensors, reframing the IO, applying a thoughtful way for people to manually configure it and personalize it that doesn't take a how-to guideline on what all these features are. And then moving everything towards a more automatic personalization, I think, is what I'm hoping where we're going, right?
I just love that view of accessibility where you start using the device, and as you pick it up, as you handle it, as you enter into it, put it on, wear it, whatever, it just makes observations about you and then adapts to you. I mean, that would just be awesome.
And it's not like Cognition can't do this, right? This is the whole industry needs to kind of think about that, right? Facebook and Google, you have your own sort of massive armies of great engineers and designers and business people. It's I think the collective overall needs to be thinking about this. And truly my perspective is that if accessibility morphs into personalization, right? Ultimately it's and how can we help automate personalization? That's a big, hairy, audacious goal that could be where accessibility actually is the tip of the spear in leading mixed reality, not being the tail on the dog, but being the nose on the dog.
Yes,
usually
absolutely.
That's how it is anyway. I mean, I call it the accessibility alchemy. There is something that needs to be created out of nothing to solve problems that other people don't know exist. So I think we're there. We're there in terms of accessibility being the tip of the spear that pushes the change. But it's up for the platform manufacturers to create the circumstances where these things can be created. The Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts. We have a huge opportunity to make it possible for things that never existed to be invented. And we're doing it wrong if this doesn't really lead towards accessibility innovation.
100%, and it feels like it's a little different this time. It feels like the awareness is there. So I'm really excited about that. I'd like to invite the audience to keep asking questions because your questions are fantastic. I'm going to get to the next audience question, but first I just want to invite, this is optional for each of the panelists, but I'd like to invite you to speak more to anything that you're working on in this space. So Regine, I'll start with you on that, and then anybody else feel free to add in.
Oh, sure. So I have been, I think I mentioned it earlier, I have been looking at tools in XR and looking at them from a lens of inclusivity and accessibility. So seeing what costs money, what doesn't, looking at who has accessibility built into their tools, or if they have voluntary accessibility documents. And over the summer, I'm going to be playing some games and looking at design patterns in VR specifically, and looking at things from, again, a lens from accessibility and inclusion, and checking the boxes or not checking the boxes of different experiences. So that is my work, and overall my research is focused on accessible and inclusive XR. So not just looking at things from an accessibility lens, but is gender considered? Is socioeconomic backgrounds considered? A lot of these tools and just devices in general are expensive. How are people? There's a VR AR association in Africa, right? So what are they working on where they have areas where internet connection may not be the best? So I'm looking into all those things.
Awesome. Are you going to be the first design patterns book in accessible VR, XR, whatever?
I forgot to mention that I am also working on book number 2. which is going to be focused on the human side of spatial computing as well. I'm writing that alongside Doug Northcook out of Chatham University.
Awesome. Let me know when it's out. I'll be your first person to buy the book.
I like the idea of spatial computing. It reminds me of what Andreas was talking about, having all of these sensors. I think that there's something really interesting. You're not going to be able to have all the sensors you need on the head of the HMD on your headset. There are all of these other sensors around you. There's your Alexas, your Google Homes, there's your phones. They all can provide context and awareness into a thoughtful, cohesive environment. And that can definitely lead into these better experiences.
Well, that's if I can pile onto that for a sec, Chris. In earlier when we opened up, we had sort of trouble sort of defining XR, right? This, you've got AR and VR, and that point you made is really kind of, I think, the value proposition of XR, right? Which is extended reality, because I think a lot of us are thinking about just how do you interact with digital content. Right, but what we're thinking about is as a wearable prosthetic for helping someone generate speech or interact with people or interact with the things around them differently, then you're actually blurring the lines, not just with controlling and interacting with digital things, but you can actually send stuff out, right? And you're controlling the physical world, right? You could control motorized wheelchairs with with a headset, or you could control your smart home, right, on the go. So if you're not home, you can interact with it, or you can tell your Roomba to do things, or, these are, first world problems, but, in the sense of, you've got the built environment is going to be smarter, right? You've got federal regulations around sustainable architectural development, city planning, things like this. So inevitably over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the city is going to get smarter and smarter, right? So how can mixed reality or AR not just be sort of this first person kind of closed in experience, but truly that you're interacting with the stuff around you in the real world.
This is great. So we're running kind of out of time, and we have 3 great questions I'd like to get to. So I'm going to ask just one person or maybe 2 to comment on each one. So let's go with Samuel Elliott. Do you see a limit with VR when it comes to hand tracking and sign language? Would that be another challenge to overcome, or do you feel like there are enough alternative solutions to render that unnecessary? I'll leave that open. Who wants to take that? No one.
Okay. It's sensors right now. It's really a matter of the sensors and the ability to recognize in 3-dimensional space the face, the hands, the torso. It is possible to solve that part of it. So the sensors part of it can be solved, but in interpreting ASL or sign language in itself is going to be really difficult, because there's no sort of canonical source of what good ASL is. So if it's just a matter of trying to mimic the sign language that a person is doing, I think that's possible. If you're wanting to have it be translated and interpreted, that's a much tougher problem.
Thanks, Christopher. I'm going to combine the next 2 questions. Hannah says, talking about all the AI, biometrics, etc. version of automatically personalizing accessibility, where are the hairy issues of data and identity, all the personal information involved in this, how and where it all gets stored, etc. And currently the lack of diversity in the initial design arena, how is that impacting things and how will it go forward? And I'm going to combine that with Johnny, who's asking something similar, which is anyone seeing HIPAA compliant bioinformatics sharing in the XR space?
This needs to be its own talk, because we only have a few minutes and we don't have enough time to get into AI. AI has its own set of issues, and if we're going to be bringing AI into the XR space, we need to address those issues across the board. Regardless of platform, there are issues with artificial intelligence. So we need to talk about those first, and I don't think we have enough time. Like 2 minutes is not enough, in my opinion, yes. Even if we did 30 seconds each. So I think that is to be continued.
That's a plug for the summit.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say, I think Natasha is listening. So yes, let's add that. And then another thing, the last one from Francis Baum, and then I'm going to go to final thoughts. To Regine's statement earlier that if the tools aren't accessible, how can we expect the experiences to be accessible? What are some of the gaps that need to be addressed first?
There's a list, right? And it's kind of long. One of the things is that the gap that I've seen just in general when it comes to experiences is that there's a lack of education around what accessibility is and what it means and how does that work into one's workflow, right? Regardless of whatever job someone is doing. And I think that when these tools were made, they were made with whoever was making them in mind, right? They weren't thinking about the broader society as a whole. And so, one, it's you always start with awareness, but then after awareness, you need action, right? And so the action needs to be on behalf of these companies to say, we're going to take the steps to make our tools accessible. First, we have to figure out what that means for us, right? Because it's an individual thing. It's not like we can across the board say, well, everybody needs to do that, this thing. And it's not the case. There are plugins for particular platforms. There are things that are available, but they're not available across the board. So each tool needs to look at themselves and then determine what their needs are in order to make things accessible. I don't have a blanket statement for that, but I'd be curious to hear what others have to say.
Thank you, Regine. And now, since we're running out of time, final thoughts quickly. All right, why don't we start with you, Matt?
It dovetails nicely with what Regine was just saying. The most important thing we can do beyond everybody who's currently a maker and thinking inclusively is to make sure that the field of makers, everybody involved in making in some way or another, that field is inclusive, diverse. So if you're in a position to help recruit, excite, motivate people from different backgrounds and with different disabilities and just everybody on the range of human experience into this field, that is a massive way that we can all make the 2020s different from the 1980s and 90s.
Thanks, Matt. Andreas?
I think we're living in a time of abundance. I think but it's not evenly distributed, right? And so I think the more that everyone on this call can convince the CEOs and the boards of directors of the companies that they work for the importance of accessibility, and not just that it's a feel good, do good kind of thing, but there's actually business quantifiable results that can come from investing in accessibility, the more you're going to see these transformations accelerate. So I think you need more tailwinds, not just regulatory tailwinds and sort of sticks, but you need more carrots, right? So we need more carrots and leadership to stand up. And we're starting to see that with some companies. Some companies like, Apple, for instance, they've been widely known for having accessibility at the core of their culture and the DNA of the company for a long time, but they've never sort of publicly been promoting it, right? But now you're seeing they're cascading. Their executive leadership team now has a part of their bonus compensation tied to accessibility. That's a big deal. You're seeing Microsoft starting to make really public statements, and Google, and like everybody, we're starting to see this emergence happening with a lot of the big tech starting to move into accessibility, but I would love to see it more broadly across the Fortune 500 or the Fortune 1000.
Thanks, Andreas. Well said. Christopher?
Yeah, for me, I'm really excited of what can happen with XR. If it provides the opportunity to adapt your physical and digital environments through technology. But I think one of the most important things for us to do is to realize that where we live here in the US is not the real world. It is a very different place in different places, and we have to create technology that really meets the need of people in different worlds. What is tenable in Rwanda is different here in Palo Alto, and we will never be able to create a product that is resonant there without understanding, collaborating with the people there. This is something that's really interesting to me, and this is something that I want to be focusing on for the next handful of years, is just bring a broader worldview towards this kind of technology. But once we have this understanding, then ideally the same technologies can be applicable to everyone, like computer vision, machine learning, contextual awareness. And then we really can have a technology that can be helpful and meaningful and powerful for everyone, and have it really be for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. And final words go to Regine.
Well, thank you all. This has been really insightful. I kind of got into this area and studying this because I want to be able to use stuff when I get older. It's a little selfish reasons, but I think I think about this all the time, and I think like Christopher said, we have an opportunity here to do some innovative stuff if we get the right people involved, like Matt said, and I cannot encourage us enough to keep talking about it. It doesn't, and not just talking about it, but actually doing it, because enough with the awareness. We're aware things need to be made accessible. Think of it for your own selfish reasons of wanting to use it as you get older, as you age. I always think about that baby crib that transfers into a bed later on, right? We need to start making the technology in a way that it grows with us as we age. And so this is all of our responsibility. If we are in this industry, we are responsible for making it so that it is usable, and not just usable for ourselves.
Thank you so much, Regine. And to all the panelists, this was so much fun. I want to party with all of you in person soon.
Hopefully.
Can I add to this, not to be sort of doom spinning here, but just statistically, so we spend a lot of time looking at global statistics and other things and whatever. But if you look at, right now, the statisticians are saying by the year 2060, which is roughly 40 years from now, we'll be at around 10.1 billion people in the world. So we're going to see a huge jump in population size. And the SSI, Social Security Administration, has said that 1 in 4 20-year-olds today will be disabled by the time they turn 67. So in 40 years, we'll be at 10 billion people, and a quarter of the population will have a disability. That's massive.
Yeah, but as I said, it's even more than that today, because above 50, you're at 34%. So visual impairment comes with your 50s, no question about it. So, but I get you. You're absolutely right. It's 100% true, and we all have to be aware of that. We've run out of time, so thank you once again to all of the panelists. A quick shout out to Global Accessibility Awareness Day is next Thursday. Please visit globalaccessibilityawarenessday.org. And now I'm going to pass it back to Natasha. And thank you, Natasha, for putting this all together.
For sure. And thank you, Joe. Thank you, Matthew, Andreas, Christopher, Regine, our captioners, and our ASL interpreters. On behalf of the VRAR Association, if you're interested in learning more, you can reach me at la@theVRAR.com. We're always looking for new members and new speakers and new topics. And if you're interested in this conversation, we'll be continuing it on June 4th at the Global Summit with these familiar faces here. So please join us then. And again, happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day month year. And thank you again, and have a great rest of your afternoon.